very much challenged by Richard's contraption, I started looking at it more closely. I've used this thing for years as well, and it turns out I didn't understand everything about it. So I want to quickly run through some of how I think it works and plant seeds for some crazy things it might be able to do, many of which smarter people like you will know it can do, and maybe some of these things are new to you. We'll see. So the main thing I did is I start with these gain curves that Richard has provided from the beginning of the product. And I think a lot of students anyway might get lost in looking at this and trying to figure this out. And so I set out to break this apart into individual cases and maybe some other cases for what happens to the gain curve on the Omnipressor, because it can do things that no other dynamics device can do, to my knowledge anyway. But before we do that, I guess it's worth orienting ourselves to, in addition to the wacky gain curves, with respect, Richard, in addition to the wacky gain curves, there are some controls here not found anywhere else. On the left side, it kind of looks like a regular compressor. It's the right-hand side where things get interesting and potentially confusing. It confused me, so I'm going to assume it confuses some students. So I'm interested in the function knob and the attenuation limit and the gain limit parameters to run through today, but I left the meter here because it's cool. Why zoom in on knobs when there's a meter right next to them? If we just look at the function knob and the meter, the function knob maybe masks a lot of what it can do. We know that this thing can do compression. So if you turn the function knob through the compression ratios, it does what you would expect. It's a compressor for those parameter settings of function. It has a unique thing of infinite compression at that particular setting. It's still all intuitive. Those are increasing ratios. And if the ratios are less than 1, it's an expander. So far, it seems pretty normal. And then a lot of people have keyed in on the extreme clockwise position of the function knob where the ratios are negative, and that makes it dynamic reversal. So already we know this isn't just a compressor. It's at least a compressor and an expander and a dynamic reverser, but it has some other features. This still doesn't show all the things it can do, and therefore all the ways one can get confused, or I shouldn't project, all the ways in which I have gotten confused when using this device. So let me go to the gain curve and set attenuation limit and gain limit to settings that might make sense. So a gain curve of 1 to 1, of course, means it's not altering the dynamics. The amplitude of the output is equal to the amplitude of the input at every instance. And so we set it up so that it can attenuate. We say the attenuation limit can be as low as 30 dB. You have to tell this thing it's allowed to attenuate, otherwise it won't attenuate. I've said it cannot turn things up by setting the gain limit to 0. You can allow it to turn things up. And I think it's the interaction of these two knobs with the really innovative function knob that makes this thing a little bit confusing, but in the end, wildly powerful. So why not compress, right? Set the function knob to a ratio of 2 to 1, and this will compress like every other compressor, at least in the logic of the gain curve, it compresses like every other compressor you know, where when it's above threshold, it attenuates to honor the rules of threshold ratio. And what's never shown on these plots is the time reaction of all this, right? So attack time and release time are hugely important to what the compressor is doing, but these curves, everything I'll show you today is steady state. Let the attack and release do what they're going to do. You have a sine wave of consistent level, wait for the Omnipressor to settle down, and this will show you what its output is for a steady state input of any value. And this is just what most compressors do. They attenuate when they're above threshold. You're wondering, why is Alex still talking? You already know this. It's because I'm not afraid to tell you things you already know and to make it take a long time. But also, what if we recognize that this kind of compression has the quality that you're bending the gain curve and that there's another approach to this? You don't have to bend the gain curve to compress or to expand. But before we do that, why don't we see what happens if you set the attenuation limit to 0? Leave it at compression 2 to 1, but don't allow attenuation. It will not attenuate, it will not compress. So all compressors already contrive to confuse us with their clumsy attack, release, ratio, threshold controls. Adding attenuation limit and gain limit makes it possible at 3 a.m. to get further confused. Why isn't it compressing? There are a couple of other parameters to keep track of this stuff. But anyway, so far, seems like it can compress above threshold like most compressors. Similarly, expansion, you can set up a ratio of 1 to 2 and it will expand, right? It expands the dynamic range by lowering the amplitude of signals that are below threshold. That's all well and good. And we might be more precise and say that's downward expansion. We're taking stuff below threshold and decreasing its amplitude so as to expand the dynamic range by turning it down when it's below threshold. And that, again, is the case of bending the gain curve. It's quite analogous to what we just looked at for compression. And of course, it's still the Omnipressor. So Tony's always telling me the Omnipressor is not another compressor. It's because it can do so many other things, including the fact that the Omnipressor is a workhorse expander. If you need this traditional approach to expansion, it can absolutely do this. But look what happens if you allow it to add gain. If you allow the Omnipressor to add gain, it will add gain so as to expand. So how do you increase the dynamic range of an input to have an output whose dynamic range is greater using gain? The way it works is you turn it up when it's above threshold. So you turn it down when it's below threshold, that stretches the dynamic range of the output, and you turn it up when it's above threshold, that too expands the dynamic range of the signal. And that means we've rotated the gain curve. We did not bend the gain curve. The Omnipressor is always working. It's rocking twice the time. It's like inward singing, if you know your literature. It's working above and below threshold. It's turning things up above, turning things down below. It's always expanding. There is no knee. And so that suggests maybe a more transparent form of expansion, or might give you other ideas for some effects. If we go back to compression, we can have a similar thing. That might, this isn't an industry standard term, but when it's compressing above threshold, it's turning it down so as to reduce the dynamic range of the output. Would we call that downward compression? I never said those words together until Richard invented the Omnipressor. But if you don't want to bend the gain curve and say, wait, can I allow gain to happen? Why would a compressor ever turn things up? Well, it needs to compress the dynamic range on output. So it will turn things up when they're below threshold. So you essentially have something called downward compression or something like that. And then below threshold, you have an upward kind of compression. Again, it's rotating the gain curve. And to be clear, it's up to Richard and Tony what to call these things. Please don't say downward compression. Well, you're educators, you're stuck. I don't have to teach students. I don't have to tell them what this is called, but we do have to teach them the logic of what it's doing. It is, here we have a 2-to-1 ratio, and you can see we have 80 dB of dynamic range in, and it's 40 dB of dynamic range coming out. It has divided the dynamic range in half. And a typical compressor that's only working above threshold doesn't do that. So this is the math is different. It depends on threshold and ratio, obviously, but it's only working half the time. It's only working above threshold. So a modest 2-to-1 ratio is going to give you substantially more dynamic range compression, again, without a knee. And so this might give us ideas for ways to tame the dynamics of a signal that are a little bit different from how we might use an 1176 or a DBX 160. For example, I think a great use case for the Omnipressor is this sort of compression, where if you think about, you have a track, a solo or a vocal. Let's do a podcast. You have a solo vocal, and your mission is to control the dynamics so that you have really consistent loudness during your podcast, and you want excellent intelligibility, but you don't want to hear artifacts of compression. You don't want it to sound compressed, but you absolutely want to rein in the dynamic range of what the non-professional voice just did in that podcast that you recorded on, no doubt, a USB microphone. So the way we typically do that is we set a ratio maybe 4:1, and then we lower the threshold and see how much we can get away with before it starts to sound unnatural and overly compressed. This gain curve says do something differently. Because the Omnipressor can turn it up when it's below threshold and turn it down when it's above threshold, I would recommend set the Omnipressor for a very tiny ratio, 1.1 to 1, just so that it does something, and then lower the threshold until the Omnipressor is bouncing back and forth between green LED and red LED, if you're familiar enough with the Omnipressor. So it's spending half its time attenuating and half its time amplifying the signal. And now you've lowered the threshold right into the used dynamics by the vocal artist, and then increase the ratio, and it will start to compress the dynamic range by turning up the lower amplitude bits and turning down the higher amplitude bits. And you can get far more dynamic range reduction at a much lower ratio or a much lower function knob setting, because it's lifting what's below threshold while turning down what's above threshold. So let's go back to expansion, because I think with most expanders, like a drum or gate, we've used this sort of thing where you have a range control and you tell the expander, never turn it down by more than X amount, whatever you specify. And the Omnipressor is happy to do that. So you can say the attenuation limit is -15 dB. That means it's going to expand, it's going to gate until it is attenuating by 15 dB. And then it's going to do, as we all should, which is return to being parallel to the 1-to-1 ratio. So this is what a regular gate does when you have a range control. And so it becomes not just downward compression, but it becomes finite downward compression. And you can adjust that on the Omnipressor, right? I've set it at 15 dB. You could say never turn it down by more than 10 dB. There are a whole range of effects you can explore this way. That's really neat. On the Omnipressor, it applies to upward expansion. You can also have finite upward expansion so that it also expands until it hits the gain limit, or in this case, the attenuation limit, because we're above threshold and it's attenuating. Until you hit that limit, it's just compressing as you would expect to, and then it stops compressing. So I don't know of, there are a couple of other compressors that have this ability to never compress by too much. This ends up being a useful ducking effect, where you can say when something else happens, turn this thing down, but don't turn it down based on the detail of something else happening. When something else happens, turn it down 6 dB and stay there. So this could be used for ducking, but for many other interesting effects. And I'll hint at an overarching insight for the Omnipressor. I believe all compressors are great for wacky attention-getting timbral and distortion effects. But a lot of what you can do with an Omnipressor, if you can dig into the many hidden features, hidden in my judgment, because it took me a while to find them, the many amazing features that Richard put into the Omnipressor, this isn't just about sensational, obvious effects. It becomes a really strategic tool to outsmart masking. It's a way to fit things in clever ways, not just make them sound radically different. So we can have finite downward compression. And so let's make sure that we understand how this works. Maybe you don't always expect it to happen. Here I can rotate the gain curve with higher ratios, and it does what you think a compressor would do. But if I go from 2-to-1 to 4-to-1 to 8-to-1, the interesting things start to happen at the extremes. And this is something you should definitely know is going on. And that is, at these points, we have reached 30 dB of attenuation and 30 dB of gain. So it returns to being parallel to the 1-to-1 ratio when you hit whatever limits you've set. I've set them to 30 plus and minus 30 dB. So it is a compressor following a compressor curve with a rotated gain curve, no knee, always compressing, which means always turning it up below threshold and down below when it's above threshold, but it will hit a finite limit and then return to being parallel. And so you might think, so what is going on? What does this sound like? This would suggest that the highest amplitudes and the lowest amplitudes of the input signal, whatever details are in that, are being preserved. It's not reshaping that waveform. They're being preserved. So transient detail could remain more accurate maybe, but for sure it's going to be 30 dB down from what it was. So it's going to be hard to hear. So I imagine most of the time this isn't audible, but a clever engineer is going to figure out how to embrace that as a feature and maybe make it sound interesting rather than accidental. If I go further still to, well, finally I drew arrows. To understand these limits, as the input swings higher and higher, and the output says you must compress more and more, it's introducing attenuation until it hits 30 dB or whatever attenuation limit you've set, and then it just stays 30 dB, no matter what the input does above that. And similarly, below threshold, it's turning it up as much as it's required by the math of threshold plus ratio, threshold and ratio. It turns it up according to that math until it hits 30, and then all it can do is turn it up by 30. So let's go on to infinity to 1. So one great feature of the Omnipressor is that Richard conquered the infinite. And we see for sure now this tail matters, where it returns to being parallel to the 1-to-1 ratio, because it's not hard at all to hit the 30 dB limit of attenuation or the 30 dB limit of gain. So it absolutely will put a vice grip on the amplitude above and below threshold coming in, force it to the same amplitude of your threshold until you hit these gain and attenuation limits. So I believe that behaves as we might expect, but, and just to check it, maybe I should skip through this, but I created a step sine wave, a 440 hertz sine wave, stepped it in 5 dB increments, and you run it through an infinity to 1, and it turns up what's below and turns down what's above. Absolutely. You can see a little bit of attack time associated with that, but it absolutely is infinite, and you can decide if snare drums need that or not. But what if we make the attenuation limit and the gain limit less than 30, make them more finite? Right here they are at 20, or make them at 10 dB. Now we're starting to, on our own, fabricate not crossover distortion, because this isn't the zero crossover point, but we're putting a kink in the wave shape that's going to lead to harmonic distortion that you might deliberately tune for fun and profit, right? You could just put in a little plus and minus 5 dB and then adjust threshold if it's reshaping the waveform in a way that you think is interesting. If I go back to infinity to 1, we would think of that, well, it's the seed of peak limiting, right? So it absolutely is. You can tell it, don't do any gain below, only attenuate when you're above threshold, and raise the threshold up high, and it's a peak limiter, right? So there are reasons to still go back and say, hey, the gain limit feature is amazing, but I don't want it to do anything below threshold. If I want a peak limit, I want it to preserve the signal at every amplitude except the highest peaks, hit that with infinity, a ratio of infinity to 1, and it will be a beautiful pink limiter. It'll certainly have the harmonic distortion of having limited the peak. It's not like that physics doesn't apply, but you can use infinity to 1 as an adjustable threshold peak limiter with fast attack and fast release. Oh, but like everything in the Omnipressor, you should first stand on your head before you move on to the next thing, because you can also tell it, hey, don't attenuate, just turn things up. And now you can say, wait, turn up the lowest level stuff. Why would you do this? Well, often isn't it true that the late part of a snare hit might be really beautiful, especially if Bill Crabtree's playing the drums, or the late part of a rototom solo, if Bill Crabtree's playing a Pink Floyd cover. Or room sound, or late parts of decay, maybe the breath between notes of a saxophone, the expressive stuff where the emotion is, maybe that's a low end level. And so the Omnipressor gives you a way to turn up only the low level stuff. And I know what you're thinking, there's noise down there. Adjust the gain limit if you dare, so that you find the part you want to turn up that you like, but don't turn up the unwanted hiss and noise that you don't like. And you'll find, as it's always been true with compression, you could waste a day or two on the snare. With the Omnipressor, we like to think you could waste a week or two on the snare. I think that's our new tagline. If we go back to infinity to 1, I just orient there and just say, we're almost done, by the way. Let's look at what happens when you go crazy and you do dynamic reversal. So -2 to 1. For 20 dB of input above threshold, it becomes -10 dB of output. So the ratio is a negative number that reverses the dynamics, but it does so with a finite amount of gain change, right? So on the right-hand side of this curve, we are turning things down until we hit 30 dB of attenuation, and then it's just 30 dB of attenuation. So again, goes parallel to the 1-to-1 ratio. And it is this tendency to go parallel to the 1-to-1 ratio that motivated me to create all these curves anyway, because you can't always hear it, or what you hear, it doesn't sound like you would expect. So I really wanted to visualize what was going on. So dynamic reversal does that. We can have a negative 1-to-1 ratio. Again, you hit those limits of dynamic range changes that you can put in a finite piece of gear, but you start to get interesting shapes. And sure enough, with a stepped sine wave, it will turn things up when they're below threshold and turn things down ever more when they're above threshold. So sorry, I'm kind of being too quick through this. We would expect that as a step sine wave, this is a sine wave that's getting 5 dB louder and then 5 dB quieter. Each of these stairs is about a second of audio of a sine wave. We're zoomed out on it. And so we see as it got higher in amplitude above threshold, it was turned down more. Its dynamics were reversed. But we also see at the extreme that it couldn't turn it up by enough. So it turned it up, but it hit its limit. We see this part of the gain curve right here where these two steps go up, and then it's in an area of dynamic reversal, and then it can't reverse any further. It's hit its limit. So we also see this part of the tail on the last two steps. So I think it can just get a little bit confusing. It takes practice to use the Omnipressor well. We're almost done. So with a negative 1-to-1 and set it to a tiny amount of gain attenuation, now you get this ability, it's a new flavor of distortion, where we used infinity to 1 compression to do a sort of hard clipping. Now it can be even more radical still. You can play with the degree of attenuation and play with the threshold. For something like this, I would certainly explore a high threshold. So basically the thing is linear, and then as your performer hits the loudest part of what they're trying to do, you enhance that performance intensity with a touch of a whole new flavor of distortion, courtesy of the gain writing that comes from a brief window of dynamic reversal. So maybe that sounds useful to you, maybe it doesn't. It's crazy what you can do. The Omnipressor will let you do this, and it's up to you to know why. One intriguing thing, I think, pedagogically, is that because we can do downward only compression and upward only expansion, we have the ear training possibility of having students undo overcompression, right? If it was compressed in the usual way, the Omnipressor could create the curve that undoes that. So it's a great, compression's really hard to hear, but could you find the ratio and threshold and attack and release settings to restore an overly compressed acoustic guitar to something that sounds more natural? I think that's a really intriguing exercise, as well as a powerful production tool. Someone sends you overdubs, they overcompressed it, you can restore believable dynamics in the signal because of the unique ability of being able to turn on and off the attenuation limit and the gain limit. So I just wanted to return to this slide and end here just to point out, so I pointed out that it's a compressor and an expander and a dynamic reverser with this infinite compression feature. But I want to point out that it's not just a regular compressor when it's compressing, right? It can do traditional downward only attenuation above threshold, or you can rotate the curve. The same is true for expansion. And we saw the many other shapes beyond that. But I just wanted to return to this to suggest that I still have a whole lot to learn about other things to do with this, only turning up the low level bits, only turning down the high level bits, and so on. It's flexible to a fault. So that's the last slide. Thank you.